again, I'll try and keep us out of the weeds as best as possible. But like, again, the body works as a system. And so like some, systems are scratching the back of other systems and aiding them and, all of those things, right? Like I guarantee, right, I can ask, most athletes who are training, like, oh, I want you to, if the goal was to row a 6-minute 2K, right? I'm just doing this so the math works in my head. Like, I guarantee they could probably put 130 up on the screen, right? How long they can hold 130 is a different question, right? Like, can you hold it for 6 minutes?
Other than that, ready to rock and roll?
Yeah, ready. Ready when you guys. You're in New York.
Cool, let's do it. We're already recording, and for everyone listening, we have Nick Goode here, who is, someone I've known for a while. I've known him since, back in the Philly days, and I know he's got a busy course load here as he begins to close out getting his PhD at East Tennessee State University. And Nick is someone who, just to kind of kick things off here, personally, I love the purpose of this podcast is obviously to create an educational platform for coaches, athletes, anyone out there who's trying to elevate their rowing specific performance, but really just elevate their knowledge and awareness of coaching and recruiting and performance in general. And I love having people like Nick on here who's going to really dive into the science behind what we do, and the science behind being an endurance athlete, and kind of relating a lot of the stuff that he's studying as he gets his PhD. He's also involved with the USRowing Pathways program and some of that stuff. I'll let him talk about that here in a second. But to me, I love having people on who can tell a little bit more about the why in what we do, because I feel I'm pretty good at saying the what. I'm pretty good at telling what we do, and maybe a little bit of why that's important. But I think someone who can really dive into the inner workings of the human body, the importance of training, and can offer a higher level of information surrounding those topics. I think those are people I really love talking to, and Nick is a great example of that. But Nick, why don't we kick things off? Why don't you give me your introduction, give the audience your introduction, tell us a little bit about yourself, the work that you're doing a little bit now, as you kind of round third and head home for your PhD, and a little bit of your involvement at the USRowing Pathways program and all that. So why don't you kick things off for us?
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. I'm happy to be here. Love chatting. I always tell people I love nerding out on science. I'll try and keep it, approachable as far as the science goes, but get you guys good information as best I can. I'm finishing up my PhD in Sports Science and Physiology here at East Tennessee. I just started working somewhat with USRowing in the Pathways, U19 Pathways program. We did some winter camps where we did lactate testing and zone prescription for, I think each session, it was like 60 athletes. So about 120 athletes over 2 really long kind of like winter camps. I've been a previous head coach at Philadelphia City Rowing, and an assistant coach at Barry University in Miami, Florida, where it was a D2, pretty good program. And then I was an elite rower as well, for about 10 years, from about 2008 through 2018. Multi-time national winner, Canadian Henley winner, traveled a little bit overseas with it as well. But yeah, I love just talking from a unique perspective as somebody who's been an endurance coach, been a endurance athlete, and now kind of like a scientist in the field. And yeah, so coaching currently some cyclists remotely and some rowers. I'm coaching also here at East Tennessee. I'm the strength and conditioning coach for triathlon, our program here, and softball. So I kind of do a little bit of everything. And I think, even if you want to build your rowing resume or, build in the rowing sphere, it's really great to kind of see what other sports are doing, because there's something to be learned from everybody. So, yeah, and that's where I kind of approach the subject, and hopefully I can give you guys some good intel from there.
Yeah, no, and thank you for that. And just for everyone to get a little context, I've known Nick for a while. He's obviously been, here in Philadelphia for probably, a good portion of his rowing career. or just his career and everything that he's doing. And funny enough, he was actually the instructor for our USRowing Level 3 seminar on training methodology actually last week. And funny enough, we had this scheduled to have you come on before I even knew that you were going to be teaching that lesson, which was funny. And also before you probably even knew that I was part of the, the Level 3, cohort. So with that, I'm really excited to dive into some of those topics, bridge those gaps a little bit. But one of the things that I wanted to kick things off with as we talk about, again, I look at myself as more, I'm a coach. I play athlete every once in a while. I still like to train and all that. So I'm constantly trying to learn new things, but I'm a coach who in many ways probably fits a lot of the college coaches out there, maybe some of the high school coaches where, again, we know a lot of the what, but the why and how we do things is something that we have the capacity to probably talk a lot about, but to hear it from people who are actually within the field and learning about that stuff, they can or just dive a little bit deeper into those details and the inner workings of why we train, putting ourselves in position for peak performance and all those different things. And I wanted to kick things off because, Nick, for you, you have prior coaching experience. You're still actively coaching, obviously. You're also deep diving into the science behind performance, particularly within the realm of endurance, athletic or endurance performance. And I just want to hear from you as we kick this conversation off, because we're going to be diving into training zones and periodization and all this fun stuff. But before we even get to that, for the coaches out there, what is the relationship of coaching and science? Meaning, like, I think a lot of times it might be, hey, like there's the science behind this, but then there's also the impact of human behavior and psychology and working with athletes. So again, there's that why we do the things we do to elevate our peak performance, but also there's those other variables that come into place in regards to athletes are humans, and because we're humans, we also have the mind that can play a big impact into our ability to perform. But I'm curious to hear from you as someone who's kind of been on both sides. What is that dynamic between science and coaching, and how can they better align themselves to, for coaches out there?
Yeah. I would say, in some ways, like coaching is based in science, right? Like the how we ask the body to perform, things like that are based in science. But coaching is a little bit more of the art, right? I think there's this back and forth between science and coaching that we're trying to get all the answers. We'll probably never have all the answers, but there's what science can do is we can start to look at influencing how the coach asks the athlete to perform. We can look at what works maybe and what doesn't work, or what has the best effect in working. There's always a spectrum in what's super effective, and there's always that human element of it that everybody is a little bit different at the end of the day. But then we can also get from the coaching side the anecdotal, like, hey, this worked. We like the in some ways the coach is the sports scientist as well. Like they're the ones experimenting on the front lines, so to speak. And we as sports scientists, we're constantly talking to coaches because like we can't replicate a grand final in a lab. Like it's just impossible. So like there's always a certain level of experimentation that the coach is going to be doing, that's going to be informing how we look at designing the next training study or designing the next test. And then we're going to try and mimic it as best as possible to give the information and try and disseminate it out to not only the coach that told us about it, but the entire coaching sphere, to like elevate us all as humans and elevate us all as athletes and coaches and things like that. So it's this constant interplay back and forth really of, science and coaching, and not always are, the best scientists, the best coaches, and all the coaches, the best scientists. But, I think when the closer we get that Venn diagram to overlap, the better we're going to serve our athletes, the better we're going to serve, our goals at the end of the day.
Yeah. And one of the things and the reason that this question always kind of comes to my mind, I think, again, there's this balance that athletes and coach, or that, goes on between the science behind what we do and the actual coaching and working hands-on with individuals and athletes. And it's like, I always kind of have the idea of like, at the end of the day, there's a foundation of work that has to go into things. You can't escape the foundation of hard work. You can't escape the fact that, hey, you can put all the science behind all this different methodology and talking about, zones and all these different things. But if you don't have this innate capacity or innate willingness to perform hard work, and hard is, again, variable, like, carries different meanings. But if you don't have that foundation where, hey, I'm willing to put in the work and actually try to put myself above, or, try to put myself in a position to improve, then all the why that goes into it, again, you're going to max yourself out because you're not willing to actually put in the work. So I think that's a big thing that a lot of college coaches, I think a lot of high school athletes, and college athletes, sorry, let me back up. But a lot of high school and college athletes, they almost science themselves out of performance because they're unwilling to, they get too caught up in whatever's been attractive on Instagram or what they read in a study or this or that. But shed a little light on how athletes can maybe, again, science themselves out of performance.
Yeah. So we talk about this, and I'm going to try and get this quote right, that one of my mentors here at ETSU said is, there's sort of like exercise science, and then there's sport science. In sport science, we sort of say is we care about the result, like we care about the gold medal, like whereas exercise science doesn't really. And so as sports scientists, we're really talking performance, right? We're not just talking about like getting healthy for your next 5K or, correcting a health imbalance or something like that. But, and so you constantly, I think, when on the side of like out sciencing yourself, like developing that critical eye as to like how to interpret what you're being told, because a lot of studies are exercise science in that they're kind of trying to explain the biology, whereas a sports scientist is going to be taking what we know about biology and trying to apply it to performance, right? And so I think sometimes you can lose yourself in the weeds of science, and it's like, okay, well, that we're explaining something, but we're not really understanding it. And I think for the high school and college athlete, especially new athletes, I always say like, almost I'd prefer you not to read, like just don't read, because again, like you said, out science yourself into like, you're sacrificing good for perfect, you're trying to like make this perfect idea. And the winning is in the subtlety, and I usually coach my athletes as well when I am talking to my athletes is, even if I am prescribing like a max effort, like VO2 effort or something like that, like we always have to meet you on the day, and you always have to perform it yourself. And so a lot of times I tell them is like, these are max intent efforts, right? And it's subtle, but it's a big difference is like, I would rather you perform at 90% of what I've observed as your maximum, if that is the full 100% of your intent on the day. Like if you're giving me your 100% and it's still 90% of what we've observed as your PR, like in some positions, as we get to periodization, we might talk about this, is like, that's what I'm asking for you of the day. Like, you're tired. I know you're tired. You've, trained all week, and we've put the 2K at the end of the week rather than the start of the week. Like, sometimes the win is the maximal intent 90% PR, and that's what's getting you the adaptation for the next day and the next week and the next month, and so I think, again, like not losing yourself in the like perfect for what is going to be good and what's going to get you advancing like long term.
Yeah, I think that's again, like I think that's one of the things that I always kind of tell athletes. It's like, hey, like you can, if you spend all your time reading and trying to get everything like I love that you said, right? Like I always say, I use that example, like don't let perfect be enemy of good, right? Like you got to take action, right? You got to move the needle forward, right, in whatever capacity that is. And if you get too caught up into the weeds, it becomes paralysis by analysis. You're almost overthinking things, and you don't take action and actually push forward. And And every once in a while, you do need to kind of go outside the lines a little bit and put yourself in a position where, okay, now you can kind of see new, like, it's like that comes back to that human element. You actually have to see it and put yourself there in those positions. But you can't get caught up too much into the weeds. But what you can do is you can understand the big picture of things and apply little principles that can hopefully help kind of move you in that direction. And I think that's a piece of kind of where I want to go today as we talk about just for athletes and coaches out there, diving into things such as the response of training, how to actually, why are we training? What are we doing all this for? And obviously we're going to keep this in the context of rowing because that's the primary audience that is watching. But talking about training and creating a training program, but I think before we even get to that point, describe to me a little bit about, okay, like we're training for peak performance. We're training for, to, again, like continue to elevate our own personal fitness as an athlete, and describe a little bit about like the why behind training and structure and all these different things that pertains to an endurance athlete. If you can, like, describe a little bit about, and in layman's terms, the science behind why we do what we do as endurance athletes who are striving to perform both individually and as a team.
Yeah. So, the body's this beautiful machine, right? Like it's, if you break it down into let's remove kind of the social aspects of it, the mind and things like that. Like the body systems, it's a closed system, right? Like everything you need to perform the movement that you want or perform the effort that you want is contained within your system, right? Now that's not to say like the next part of that makes it a beautiful machine is it adapts, right? It advances, things like that. But it can only respond to the stimulus that you provide on it, right? Or it only responds to what you ask it to do, right? And so if you never ask it to go hard, like it's never going to be good at going hard. And so, like we design training plans, we design, as an athlete or as a coach, right? Like the whole idea we're trying to do is like get you outside of your physical comfort zone a little bit so that the body knows like, hey, like I always laugh, one of the like jokes or, when I lecture to students and things like that is, you want to go run a marathon or you want to go row a 2K. Like that is something your body doesn't really want to do. Like it likes, sitting on the couch and like being comfortable, and it's trying to always maintain that comfort. But by asking it to go run that marathon or, row that 2K, like it gets this really hard stimulus where it was like, that was really difficult. I would like it not to be that difficult the next time. And so it's going to then institute all of these adaptations and these changes in like literally some of the training that you do is literally changing kind of how your DNA is structured. Like it's sending these messages to the cells and things like that to adapt so that the next time you ask it to do something hard, you can either do it harder if you ask it to, or that same effort becomes easier, and I think that's just the beauty of the human body is that it is so plastic, but also this like really well-designed machine.
Yeah. And with the training that we're doing, like that athletes are doing, like in terms of, and I remember in your, in the conversation or in the discussion last week that you gave, talking about the response from stimulus that the body gets, right? Like you put it through some kind of stressor, training stressor. Right. You fatigue yourself, but then you come back and it almost has this accumulation, or you almost, again, you overcompensation to withstand the next effort, right? The body's telling itself like, hey, like I'm going to, I recognize this made me tired. Now I'm going to kind of come back and hopefully be a little bit better prepared for the next bout. And describe a little bit about like, is that like, are those like a accumulation of training, like for athletes out there, right? Like, is it like accumulation of all these different things, right? All these micro stressors, these one sessions that elicit this response that create that long-term effect that you may see a couple weeks later? Like, describe that process a little bit.
Yeah. So that sort of response paradigm, or response cycle that we talk about, we provide a stimulus, or we provide some kind of stressor, and the body goes into alarm, and it says, "Hey, that was really tough. I'm not ready to, like I'm not even at like baseline anymore. Like I'm tired. I've got to repair all of those things." Um, and then it recovers from it, and then it starts to say like, "Hey, maybe we can adjust like an enzyme, or like a fiber composition, or any of these things that when we talk about like chronic adaptation, it's going to change some of those things that we sort of, like you said, overcompensate or supercompensate. So now we're fitter, we're stronger, we're more resilient for the next bout. And so that's why a lot of times we say like very consistency, because you want to like consistency is key, because you want to like when it overcompensates or supercompensates, you want to provide another stimulus if you're looking for, improving long term. Like you want to keep improving, because if you don't provide the stimulus at that supercompensation point, or when we've recovered, what we have is like, let's say you got as fit as you ever did, right? And then you stopped exercising, right? Like naturally, your fitness is going to start to drop off, right? And so if you don't provide that chronic stimulus time and time again, what's going to happen is like you're going to supercompensate, but then you might return to baseline. And so now you're going to do that same stimulus again, and you're really only going to get to what your previous supercompensation was, or your previous baseline. So you're really trying to like, and I don't always like using the word, like biohack, like it's kind of a buzzword, but what we're trying to do is hit that supercompensation point and provide another stimulus, so that when it supercompensates again, we're now 2 steps forward, and then 3 steps forward, and like we're not just like doing the same thing over and over again.
What's up, everyone? Kevin Leslie, and quick interruption to the podcast. If you're a high school rower who aspires to take that next step and row at the college level, and you're trying to figure out what is the best path for me, how do I find the best fit academically, athletically, and personally, let's have a conversation about it. Let's set up a Zoom meeting where we can dive into, this is what I'm looking for in terms of schools, this is what I'm looking for in terms of rowing programs, and how do we build a plan that can best position you for long-term success. And this will take one of 2 routes. It can be specifically within recruiting, where we're creating a list of schools, and based off those schools, we're reaching out to coaches. Or you could come to me and say, "Hey, Kevin, I want to row at this level. I might not be there today, but I want to develop a path that can guide me in that direction and set me up where one day that could be a possibility." And we're going to have that conversation in our Zoom meeting. And right now, throughout the spring season, we're setting up free Zoom meetings for all the podcast listeners using the code SPRINGRACING24. So use that code, set up a meeting, and let's begin to initiate that conversation and get you moving in the right direction. So again, set up a Zoom meeting on my website, SPRINGRACING24, and let's begin to move you in that direction. Now back to the show. Peace. And to that point, one of the questions that I had for you related to how the body responds to things, let's kind of take it to the language of probably the majority of people listening, including myself, right? Like speaking in terms of like the practicality and like, how does this pertain to me? And as you relate to, or, when you think about like, okay, like in order to see and realize progress, I have to continually push my body out of its comfort zone, allow myself to recover, so I can return and do the exact, and do it again, right? At hopefully a greater intensity or greater workload, whatever it may be. Is it in order to grow or develop that baseline fitness, right? To raise that base level fitness. And again, we're going to kind of get into the full on training structure of things here in a minute, but is it something where, okay, if I'm trying to provide progressive overload or response to my body, is it more like, okay, let's use an easy example, right? 5 by 5 minutes, at, with 5 minutes rest, right? High intensity type work, to kind of, again, really push the needle forward. Does that mean like, okay, if I'm going to try to push or provide progressive overload, because that's a common workout, right? 5 by 1500, 5 by 5 minutes, right? Adequate rest or enough rest in between, 1 to 1.
Yep.
does that mean, hey, like next week I'm doing 6 by 5 minutes? Does that mean next week I'm doing 5 by 5 minutes at a higher intensity? Like I'm trying to go faster? Like what is like the bare bones to like that, progressive overload?
Yeah. So if we look at it, and so the adaptation syndrome that we were talking about here for a second, right? Like it's both on the like singular session and the chronic sessions, right? Like how it goes over like a training block or something like that. You know, in the training session, we're still using that kind of like alarm and recovery phase. Like think about 5 by 5. If I were to shorten your work or your rest interval to 2 minutes, right? Like you're not going to be even back at baseline. You're going to like see diminished returns on those 5 minutes because you're just not recovering. You're not getting back to that baseline. Now, acutely, we're not going to see that super compensation so much. So it's like I wouldn't expect you with like 6 minutes rest being able to do, 10 more watts or something like that. Like there is a limit to how much we can push acutely. I would say, one thing that endurance athletes, the best endurance athletes, I think when they advance or when they have the right mindset, let's go that way, is they really know how to celebrate marginal gains, in that week to week. Now, I would say that like as you design your training program, like 5 by 5 is kind of a classic one because we talk about it being like 25 minutes of like high intensity work, right? Like the total work. That same amount of work, like the energy systems in your body, like I would doubt that like there's 30 minutes in there. It's like we start to find some of these trends in sports science that these seem to be like sweet spot like work. It's like how long you can maintain an intensity, and that duration is not going to change wildly week to week. So I wouldn't say progressive overload for a workout like that would be adding a sixth one. Usually it's going to be performing it faster at a higher power output. And when you think about those things, is like I think this is the coach side of it, is putting that stuff in perspective for newer athletes and putting that in perspective for the athlete, because the athlete is looking for like, oh, if I did it at 200 watts, like I'd love to see it be done at 250 watts. Like that, I mean, you look at that, that's a 25% increase from 1 week. Like that's a phenomenal like change that we would not really expect to see. But getting the wins where you can, the 5 watts here, trying to be more consistent. If you saw like progressive overload might be is like, oh, I did 3 of them at this power output, and my 4th one was a little lower. The 5th one I kind of rallied for, right? Progressive overload for the next week might be consistency across the 5, right? Because then we've increased and we've overloaded the total 25 minutes of average power output because we've brought that 4th one up a little bit. So like I think it's progressive overload is defined in a lot of different ways, and pushing yourself. But at the end of the day, like that's where that max intent comes in. That's where the athlete part comes in, is like, can you push yourself that little bit more, the next week, or, and you might also see like, okay, week 1 to week 2, there's not much, but then like the body starts picking up that steam with adaptive, and building, that we see it 3rd week, 4th week, or something like that.
Yeah. And I think that's I like the way you said that, where it's like, there's a lot of different ways to express progress. And again, that might be, just, hey, like your first time going at it, right? That 3rd and 4th one really shocked your system and you quote unquote fly and died and this and that. It's like, okay, well, let's do the same workout the following week. And can you get consistency through that, right? Can you get the same output on each of those pieces? And through that, again, you might not see it on paper on that day, but through that, you are overloading, you're progressing your body's response. I think that's a valuable piece, because like there is, again, like there's other factors that can come into a performance on that day, right? You didn't get, the sleep that you wanted, right? It just wasn't a good day for this or that. Yeah. That could kind of impact things. But again, like, are you able to kind of put yourself in a position to put your, max out that kind of workout, right? Or put your best foot forward, and you're going to see that progress at some point down the line. I think that's an important thing, because people get hung up on the binary, like, hey, did I PR? Did I not? Did I do better or did I not?
Right. Yeah.
Which I think could impact.
Yeah. and there are so many variables that go into performance, right? I think we sort of talked about it a little bit last week as well with something like a 5 by 5. Like when you're designing your training plan, like I can progressively overload you in more ways than just say the power output that you're doing, right? Like I could progressively overload you in the stroke rating I'm asking you to go, right? Like when we start talking about race specific training, like early on in the season, maybe we're doing 5 by 5 at a lower stroke rating. And as we get closer, like I'm using those 5 minute pieces to get us like race ready. Like I might move up the stroke rating. And so that's going to be the progressive overload is learning, how to get your body to move with that new race rhythm, with that new output and become more efficient, and things like that.
Yeah, no, I think that's awesome, and that's just really good context for coaches out there who are trying to think of different ways to move the needle forward, right? Continue to push their fitness forward. And the area that I'm really excited to talk about, right? I want to talk about the full picture of training programs and stuff like that. But I figured before we get to that, talking about the puzzle pieces within a training program, particularly
Mm-hmm.
within endurance athletics, and more along the lines of training zones and testing. Training zones
Mm-hmm.
and testing. And those are those are the areas that like I'm super curious about because again, like, and I'm sure the audience is a lot of people listening because there's so many different ways that go around the rowing networks in terms of, hey, like testing and what training
Mm-hmm.
zones. And they hear a lot of terminology like, lactate threshold and,
Right.
UT1 and 2, like all these different things. And
Right.
I'm curious for you, and we can kind of take this different ways or multiple different approaches to this, but like this is an area that I did want to spend some time on just to kind of provide some context for athletes and coaches out there where it's like, obviously we know that training zones are important for progress, for keeping us, to
Mm-hmm.
kind of use performances to create structure and guide our training moving forward. And then obviously to reassess your training zones, you have to test, right? You have to kind of put
Yeah.
yourself in situations where, okay, am I realizing
Yeah.
progress? And whichever one kind of approach you wanted to kind of go with first, but describe a little context around training zones, particularly for
Mm-hmm.
endurance athletes, for rowers, obviously, and then also the testing that correlates with reassigning or kind of getting training zones
Yeah.
reestablished. Let's dive into that for a little bit. I think that'd be a great one for
Yeah.
athletes.
I I mean it's a subject that we could probably spend a whole 2 hours talking about. So we're gonna we're gonna try and give the cliff notes here for this one. But uh, so training zones are one of those things that there's a ton of information out there, and I would say like more often than not, it's reading and trying to develop what works for you as an athlete. If you're on your own, what's simplest enough for you to follow and be consistent with. Um, or as a coach, what you have at your disposal that you can actually design these training zones from, right? Um, if you look in the literature and the science side of it, right? Like there's some people that say there are 3 zones, right? Like, and we just do like an aerobic threshold and an anaerobic threshold, and we just, okay, there's 3 zones. There's, low intensity, there's this middle intensity, and then there's this like high intensity. And then based on the level of research that's been done, whether there was like a muscle biopsy or, like what kind of testing they were doing, people start saying like, oh, there's actually 5 zones. It's like we can divide that middle one into 2 zones, like, and then there's like maybe 2 zones above that middle one, right? So there's like low intensity and there's, all of these like subtle nuances where at the end of the day, what they're trying to do is again chase that very specific adaptation, and to not get in the weeds and over science everybody, like there's different muscle fibers, and so they've found that certain muscle fibers are trained better at this intensity than that intensity. Different enzymes are upregulated at this intensity versus that intensity, and it's different than just like saying lactate threshold or anaerobic threshold, right? um, at the end of the day, as a coach, there's just this idea that you're trying to get like a holistic look at the athlete, right? We want to know how their endurance is, and endurance can go kind of with their efficiency or their economy. We want to know when exercise gets hard, like what is the kind of power output that they can do. And then we want to know kind of like peak values, like what is the absolute ceiling for my athlete, to try and put that in context, right? Like in especially as a coach, like what maybe is underdeveloped, what's overdeveloped, where do we have to kind of focus our energy to get the athlete to be performing their best. And that's all within context of what the event we're asking the athlete to do, right? Like if I was asking you to run a marathon, right, and your I see that your peak power is like really great, but your endurance is, like that's where I'm going to focus, right? Like I'm never going to ask a marathon runner to be a sprinter, right, and vice versa. So it's all within that context of what we're asking the body to do. And then from there, we can dive into testing. Like the funny thing is anaerobic threshold. Everybody seems to know that kind of like pair of words, but like again, getting into too many of the weeds that we see some coaches and some athletes go is like, well, how do you define anaerobic threshold, right? Is it a ventilatory marker? Is it how hard you're breathing? Is it lactate, right? Like, and even within the realm of lactate, well, is it a set like, okay, you're over 4 millimoles of lactate, that's anaerobic threshold, or is it somewhat individual, right? Like if I were to do a step test with you, I would venture to say it's a little bit individual. It's based on your training up until that point. It's based on a little bit of your genetics, your predispositions, things like that. Like it might not be 4 millimoles. It might be something like 3.8, and so now I have an individual threshold for you. So there's like laboratory tests, and then there's what we call field tests. And that would be something like, oh, I'm going to ask you to row a 6K, or I'm going to ask you to do an hour, or I'm going to ask you to do 7 stroke max, right? And all of those field tests can also, again, if you don't have a lactate analyzer, you don't have like a metabolic cart where you can collect oxygen as the athlete's, exercising, like those field tests were designed explicitly with that in mind to try and give you a holistic picture of your athlete.
So, yeah, I think the field tests are kind of like, if we had to kind of summarize, like I would say 95% of the athletes out there, the coaches out there, are probably limited to field tests. Yeah. Obviously, in a perfect world, like it'd be doing the laboratory testing and this and that, right? And probably for many of them, it is those field tests. I love that label, field tests. I just think that's a great way to kind of describe it, because again, like I think that puts into context, or that's what all these coaches out there who, again, like we all have this beautiful machine that some like, some despise, but it's called an erg, right? Like, and it's this great machine that allows us to get on-demand feedback for specific performances. And talking about those field tests and some of the areas that I really, again, like at the elite, right? You see it on Instagram with the US national team, right? They're doing the testing, the lab testing and all that, right? They have that capacity, and rightfully so, because they're trying to do the highest of the highs, right? Obviously, you described a little bit of the lab testing that you were doing, with the USRowing athletes, right? But again, there's that majority who are the field tests. And also, I think it's also one alternative where we kind of get back to taking the science out of some things and just kind of sticking to practicality a little bit, where it's like, hey, like, don't overcomplicate training, like here's what we can do. And describe a little bit more about like the field tests and creating some structure around, again, like the easy one is 2K testing, but you said, Watts testing or 6K testing and some of those different things. Describe a little bit about that process and how coaches and athletes can get guidelines, because there's nothing perfect about it, right? But guidelines to structure their training.
Yeah. So as you're talking about kind of like lab usage, right? Like those are really, I would say, like their power shines when you're looking for that extra 1 to 5%, right? Like when you're dealing with the best athletes, or you have an athlete who's plateaued, like, okay, well, we just need to, we need a better tool, right? To measure what we're looking at. A field test is great, and it was designed, again, for accessibility. The nice thing about a field test also is, depending on which ones you're using, like you can also use that, and we might get to this eventually, is like, and talking about it here, is like how do we monitor our progress, or how do we, monitor our athlete is training at the right level, they're not overtrained or undertrained, things like that. Those field tests are great because at the end of the day, they're kind of like a practice, right? Like they're a practice session, right? Um, and so depending on when you use them, how you use them, like you could literally, when used the right way, you could use it multiple times throughout a season, and it's now your check-in point. It's not even like a test per se; it's a check-in point. Um, and you know, any, uh, I would say like anything that is reproducible, like even your 5 by 5 minutes could be a field test of sorts, right? Like it's, as long as it's reproducible, you're maintaining a certain rigor that it's done relatively the same way every time. Like you can use it as your check-in. Um, and then when you talk about the different types of field tests, we're really like, that's where the design of those field tests come from a steep basis in science. Like we know that the phosphocreatine system, like the high power output, it lasts only about 5 to 10 seconds, right? Well, that's a peak watt test, right? Like that's 7 strokes, if that. Um, we know that is like glycolysis and anaerobic metabolism. Like that's going to be your, 30 seconds to like 90 seconds power window, right? And so that's your peak 1 minute test, right? Like that's how hard can you go for a minute? Like that's your anaerobic capacity, if you will. Then you have things like VO2 max, right? And that's kind of like your bread and butter 2K, right? Like it's it's 6 minutes, 7 minutes, or however long it is. Like, in an 8, it'd be like 5 minutes, but like we're dealing with a range of like 5 to 8 minutes. That's probably about the ceiling of like absolute maximum oxygen consumption that you can maintain for that duration, right? Like having to do it longer than that, you're going to see power output start to drop, and you're going to start to rely on different uh, energy systems. So, again, good field test, somewhere around 5 minutes, like 5 to 2K length. And then you have, on top of that, then like what we'd call like your aerobic capacity. Like what's your kind of like all day pace, or sorry, before that, we might even get to a lactate threshold, right? Because 2K is above lactate threshold. Like a lactate threshold or an anaerobic threshold effort is something that, again, in cycling, we call it FTP. It's a 20-minute test. In rowing, we have a similar test. It's called a 6K. It's like around 20 minutes long. Like you start to see these like different modalities start to agree on some of these things, even though it was independently tested. Like about 20 to 30 minutes is what you can maintain at threshold pace. And then, like I said, there's aerobic endurance, right? Your kind of all day pace. Like what's the maximum pace you can do for, in cycling, it'd be like 2 hours, 3 hours. Like, and that would be like your 60-minute test, right? Or you're maybe not like, or you're just like longer endurance paces, things like that. Those might be your check-ins for like what your peak like critical speed was, or something like that, where you're talking about like what's your kind of all day, what can you do and you maintain. Really, the limiting factor on those all day paces are going to be like, did you eat enough that morning? Not the intensity was so hard that you couldn't keep doing so you start to see these like trends happen, and then it's like finding a test that works for you, works for your squad, within those realms, right? Like we can argue semantics of using a 6K versus a 5K, right? And I would say for different populations, like a 5K is better than a 6K, because if we're talking about like a 20-minute effort, really we're talking about like a heavyweight male, right? But for an open weight female or a novice or a high school athlete, like the 5K might be the better choice there, because again, we're just trying to assess that 20-minute power, so.
That was actually that's some gold right there. Because again, like I think there's the field test, like there's the like, hey, like we're gonna do 2K testing at this time, right? Or we're gonna do 6K testing. Well, it's like what's the the true like like where did those tests kind of manifest themselves? And obviously, part of it is like,
Yeah.
hey, we race 2Ks in the spring. We do,
Right.
head to Charles in the fall. Like, okay, well, we're probably doing 5Ks around this time and 2Ks around
Yep.
this time. So there's that piece of it. But to actually understand the actual, like, hey, like in broad base, we hear these terms, VO2 max, we hear these terms, lactate threshold. Okay, well, there's a correlation there where, okay, if you're a high school athlete, high school girl in, your sophomore, junior, even senior year, and you're doing a 6K and it takes you 26 minutes, well, are you
Yeah.
really training the response that you're truly trying to test? Where, okay, maybe you could do a 5K and you're trying to do that in 22 minutes, or like you're at least closer to what
Yeah.
the purpose behind that test is, which is training for anaerobic threshold, right? Or at least within that kind of range.
Yeah.
Is
Yeah.
that
There's testing for those ranges, and then there's like training for those ranges, right? Like, I'm just thinking back to my training days, right? Like when I was training a 6K, we would do stuff like 2x6K, and we would do stuff like, 3x4K, right? Where we're trying to train a certain intensity, but we're trying to, like back to our progressive overload, we're trying to do it longer, right? Like if I know if I'm doing 12K is 3x4K, like, but I'm holding 6K pace, like that's my 20-minute pace or my 19-minute pace, whatever it was at the time. Like, but I'm trying to reproduce that for longer and longer. And so I'm progressively overloading the system that I'm eventually going to test, right? And so that's how, for coaches, like I challenge them to like structure their thought process. Like, oh, I want this intensity. That's the intensity I'm trying to train because that's the field test or the intensity we're looking for. And then when you ask then the progressive overload question, that's where it comes to how do you design the practice, right? Like, oh, I want to overload the time that they're at that zone. I know they can hold it for 20 minutes. Well, I want to see if they can hold it for 24 minutes. If I want to see if they can hold it, but I have to then divide it up a little bit because like the day after we test or 2 days after we test, like they're not going to be magically able to hold it for 24 minutes.
Yeah.
So
we're about to go down another one that I'm super curious about, because let's bring it to 2K testing a little bit. And in regards to one of the things that I always kind of, it's like if you're training for 2K, I think one of the things that a lot of high school and college, not necessarily college, I think they kind of get to a level where they're a little bit more driven by what the coaches are saying. But I think a lot of high school athletes try to take ownership into their own hands, guided by whatever to get to college and get us all this other stuff. So
yeah,
what goes through their mind is constantly 2K, 2K, 2K. I got to perform
right.
2K, right? And in part of their processing is, okay, like I got to do more intensity. I got to do, the best way to do a 2K is to do another 2K and get comfortable there. And I think a lot of that, again, is driven by external influences.
Right.
But using this kind of structure of progressive overload, not to get, because every athlete is different, but talking about like, okay, like to train for peak 2K performance, and maybe this will kind of bridge the gap into talking more about training programs and things like that. But describe a little bit about like some of the training that can get into being able to perform at a high level a VO2 max type effort / 2K type performance. Describe a little bit about like the different variables that have to go into some of this, and also maybe some of the ideas of like, hey, like it does take a blend of training, not just this right, one modality or one form of training. Describe that a little bit.
Right. Yeah. So that's where we get into, like, again, I'll try and keep us out of the weeds as best as possible. But like, again, the body works as a system. And so like some, systems are scratching the back of other systems and aiding them and, all of those things, right? Like I guarantee, right, I can ask, most athletes who are training, like, oh, I want you to, if the goal was to row a 6-minute 2K, right? I'm just doing this so the math works in my head. Like, I guarantee they could probably put 130 up on the screen, right? How long they can hold 130 is a different question, right? Like, can you hold it for 6 minutes? And as we kind of alluded to in our testing and our zones discussion, right? Like there's VO2 max, and then there's lactate threshold, which was like lower than VO2 max. So if we start stratifying our like zones, right? Like VO2 max is the top, lactate threshold somewhere below that, endurance is way down, below that. And so we have these like zones. So that means like that lactate threshold, how wide that zone is, like might make that unattainable for 6 minutes, right? So we want to bump that up a little bit. And we can say that we're using a lot of high energy molecules or usage, however you like. The technical term would be glycolysis, right? Anaerobic metabolism to maintain that VO2 max. And I think some athletes lose themselves in the weeds that like, oh, I just need more intensity. I just need to like keep raising my ceiling. But they forget that the aerobic side, it's still an endurance sport, right? Like we're talking about something that's lasting for over a minute and a half. Like anything over a minute and a half to 2 minutes is basically considered an endurance event. And to talk about the aerobic endurance side, your type 1 muscle fibers or your, how many blood vessels are feeding the muscle, right? How much mitochondria are in the muscle. Like that's the science side, but like that base, what we sometimes forget is when lactate's being produced at those high intensities, right? And we see hydrogen ions and things like that, like making it difficult to maintain. The aerobic side is what's taking that lactate and sort of like reconverting it into something else, like, or to use it so that it doesn't build up as fast, right? And it's an oversimplification, right? That there's all these different types of type 2 fibers and type 1 fibers, and like that's getting a little bit more into the weeds. But like when we use glycolysis, when we use lactate to perform high power outputs, that lactate is either going to sit around in the muscle or it's going to get shuttled somewhere else to be used in helping the effort. And so slow, fast glycolysis, like this interchange, this blending of energy systems that happen at VO2 max, because all like the body doesn't just go, oh, we're done with an aerobic now, I'm not using that anymore. Like when we're up here at the peak, we're using everything below it, right? And so when we build up that base, that means it pushes up our lactate threshold, right? We can accommodate more lactate. We can handle, the shuttling of it around the body quicker. And then that's going to get that lactate threshold pushed up. And then that's going to allow for maintaining that VO2 max effort a little bit longer or pushing that VO2 max effort up, right? And so, getting lost in the idea that like, oh, I just need to, like, I want to hold 130. I can do it for 2 by 500 right now. And I need to do it now for 3 by 500 and 4 by 500, 6 by 500, like, and just getting into this like meat grinder of like, oh, it's more intensity is what I need. Like, and sometimes they neglect that, like, well, we're not supporting that intensity in any way. We're not building the pyramid the right way, I think that's where you still have to approach the body as like a holistic single machine. And so we have to make sure all of the systems are working well.
Yeah. And I like to describe, like, again, like without the, again, like trying to take the, where it's like that, again, like I think I know enough to talk a little bit about how to explain it to athletes, but I don't know the actual inner workings of it like you do, right? Like,
yeah.
And the way I like to describe it is like, because again, like this is such a common question that I get from high school athletes where it's like, I gotta do more intensity. I gotta practice my high rates. I gotta do this and that, right? Like, but they overlook the fact that there's that whole base underneath that needs to continue to evolve. And that's kind of the way I describe it, where it's like, okay, like you can practice the high intensity, the 500s and the minute intervals at 36 plus and this and that. But if you neglect what's going on underneath, you're kind of putting yourself, you're capping yourself, right? There's going to be a point of ceiling that you're not going to be able to break through until you evolve that foundation underneath. Is that maybe another way to think about it?
Yeah, for sure. And I think it's, when we talk about like the whole muscle, right? If we want to talk about like the sciences, right? Like we got to make sure that there's enough blood flow. We got to make sure that there's enough mitochondria and like molecules there to like process and create energy, right? And so all of those different training zones or training intensities are trying to elicit some kind of adaptation in one of those variables to make the holistic approach go. And so like to kind of like draw it to like the other end of like an extreme is like if we were to look at like an Olympic weightlifter, right? I guarantee if I taught an Olympic weightlifter how to row, like he's going to outperform short term any rower on an erg, right? Like they just know how to create power, right? Like when you see, a 70 kilo or an 80 kilo athlete put 300 pounds over his head in one movement, like that's impressive. That's a lot of power output. But again, it's a single event. It's not an endurance event, right? And to tie it into like muscle morphology, right? Like there are very type 2 like high energy muscle fibers. Like that's basically all they are. And an endurance athlete has to have some of those type 1 fibers so that they can make those type 2 fibers last longer, if that is like an oversimplification, right? Like everybody's got those muscle fibers in different ratios. And so what creates the difference between a power athlete and an endurance athlete is the endurance athlete's going to have more of those type 1s. They're going to like have more endurance, to just like use the definition in the definition, right? Like they're going to have those type 1 fibers supporting that power output to be able to maintain it longer. Like it's not going to be as high, but it's going to last a lot longer, right? And so that's where you see like I think the big difference in drawing that stark contrast between, oh yeah, it's great to have intensity. Well, like Olympic weightlifters, plenty of intensity, but no duration, right? And you need that aerobic base to kind of build that up, like you said.
Yeah. And is that where you can learn a lot about that intense, or you can learn a lot about that base through other field tests? So you can learn a lot about that base, right? When you talk about that base, it comes back to that AT, right? The anaerobic threshold or lactate threshold. Like,
yeah,
it comes back to that idea of, hey, like if we want to, you can test your 7-stroke max all you want, but
yeah,
let me see what your base is, right? Let me see what your
right.
20-minute test is, because that's what's actually going to be, again, that large base underneath. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
Is that kind of how you?
yeah, for sure. And I think it goes back to, there is no one single test that is perfect. If you call it the 2K, like let's say the 2K was the perfect test, like that's really a performance test. Like we just want to see what you're capable of when the race happens, right? It's not really a training tool, if that makes sense. Like that I'm drawing this distinction that's very performance based, whereas the 2K as a single, like, yeah, I can make some assumptions about how the athlete is, but it's not the whole athlete, right? It doesn't provide that background of, well, okay, what's your endurance like? What is, like, what does 60 minutes look like? What does peak power look like? They're all interrelated, but if you're not looking at some of these other variables throughout the year, I think as a coach, you might be doing yourself a disservice to to up your training game. Like when I was back training, I remember, we almost did an hour check-in every week. It wasn't a max hour of power check-in. It was just like, hey, I just want you to row for 60 minutes at like a 7 or 8 out of 10, like 6 or 7, like somewhere in there, and just try and like maintain your power output. And so that was like both our kind of monitoring check-in to make sure that we weren't over fatigued and under fatigued, or peaking or things like that. But it was also just like checking that aerobic base. Like, are we still pretty good there? Can we still check that box, of aerobic base?
Yeah, and I think that's awesome, and I think that's really valuable for athletes. And I think I got 2 more questions in regards to that, and then we'll progress to some training structure. But again, this is a rabbit hole that is a lot of fun for me to
Yeah.
dive deeper in, because again, it's like a lot of times you can understand the topics, you can understand what, and that key piece, but to kind of actually truly understand the why for both myself and for other athletes out there, I think is really valuable. But I think if you think about an athlete who's, again, if they're like 645 on the erg, for 2K, right? High school boy, right? Or college or whatever, right?
Yeah.
Like, but high school boy athlete, high school man, and they're trying to progress to 630, right?
Yeah.
Is the idea of, hey, you just got to do 2Ks until, you get comfortable at that pace. 2K, 2K, 2K. Is that the approach that they need to take, or is it more like, hey, like again, like come back to this broad base of there's variability, like, or sorry, there's different buckets that we need to draw
Mhm.
from in order to close that 15-second gap.
Yeah.
Describe that a little bit if you don't mind.
Yeah. So
Obviously, everyone's
I think
different though,
there's
right? Like
right.
every athlete's different, but yeah,
Right. Well, and like we can talk about, well, did they just start rowing a month ago? Like if they
good
just
point.
started rowing a month ago, they're probably not
They'll be
like
there in
they're
no
just
time.
not yeah, like there's like no mental capacity yet. They're like they haven't figured out how to go that hard
Yeah,
yet, so they just need to practice going that hard,
yeah,
you know? And they're going to have to experiment with it. It's like sometimes it's going to work, sometimes it's not. Like it's going to be a little, I think when we're talking about, okay, they've been training for a while, maybe they're in their JV year or something like that, right? I think that's where it's smart to take kind of the step back and say like, well, okay, like what are the energy systems looking like? What's your endurance look like? Like some of those things that are going to build that 2K probably will help more. And what we might be finding is especially the athletes who, let's call it testing fatigue. Like they just test so often, right? And they see like, oh man, I'm just not improving, right? That plateau might be coming from like it's too much intensity. Like we're again back to like bring our conversation full circle. Like we're only getting back to baseline every time. We're not letting the body like rest and recover to get super compensation before the next session, right? Like so that's where when we are planning our training and our training design, that's where using some of these other intensities is super important because it allows the body to unload that fatigue, but still train, right? Like if I'm training endurance, like if I'm training aerobic endurance, especially, I can be a little bit fatigued from an intense day and still get a training adaptation from doing, endurance performance, right? Um, and then with that variability throughout our week, throughout our month, like things like that, like we're going to enter into less fatigue. We're going to be more prepared for performance, right? Like we're going to also have trained some of those other training systems more, and they're going to be more efficient. And like we see this like snowball effect when you vary your training and when you start looking at the holistic athlete, into what makes a good performance.
yeah. No, that's great insight into again like those different puzzle pieces that go into the performance of what a 2K brings, but
Yeah.
there's different variables that go into how to actually extract that peak performance, actually push it forward.
Hmm.
And let's bring it to training programs, and actually that's kind of the puzzle pieces, that or the blocks that you can kind of think about it,
Hmm.
right? Like, hey, like we need a blend of different methods of training or intent
Yeah.
behind our what we're doing. Then you think about the actual full on picture. And one of the
Hmm.
things that you dived into was this idea of how to structure a training program, methodology behind it, periodization. And
Yep.
when we look at things from that context of, okay, well, how do I take all those puzzle pieces? I have a new baseline test that I did, whether it's a 5K or 2K, whatever it may be. I have this baseline. How do I start to actually put that on paper with the vision of a peak performance down the line or multiple peak performances throughout the season
Yeah.
with, maybe one at the end, right? We can
Yeah.
dive into, kind of shed a little light on that, the bare bone or the base of that structure and how you can
Hmm.
kind of start to piece that together. And then also some of the why behind that as well.
Yeah. So, generally speaking, right? Like we still like things that haven't really been like disproved, debunked, or anything like that. Is we still kind of build from like long to peak, right? Like we start with base kind of intensities and we work our way up to like peak intensities. Um, there is something out there calling like reverse periodization, where it's like, oh well, we start with the intensity and then we build the base, and it's a little wishy-washy, like whether or not it's like really going to work. It's worked in some very specific studies, but not kind of like as a global idea yet. Um, but like with the idea, especially in endurance sports, like building your base and then refining it as you get more intense is super important. Um, and so I think, you know, it's funny because like it's the why, why does the fall look like 5K season, right, is because we're building those longer intensities. Like it works well if we're trying to peak for, an early summer, late spring kind of event. Well, like the fall correlates very well to being base building, right? And so we found a racing opportunity, a check-in opportunity with a 5K, Um, so like we look at our entire year, and then we kind of, if you want to take a step back even farther, you start looking in like, like a college athlete from freshman to senior year, right? Or things like that. Like how do we develop over time? Uh, in team sports, we talk like redshirting and things like that. Like, like they're a good athlete, but like we want to develop them for that first year before we really like unleash them into like the competition sphere. Um, that's like a step above even annual periodization, right? Like that's long term. Um, and so I might be losing where we were going with this a little bit in design, but again, just like you do your check-in, you um, get your new training values, right? Like as you're training, you try and push those needles a little bit. You don't ever, I would say, like ever not touch VO2 max, right? Like it's not like we're doing only base training, like we just do it less, right? Like in the fall, we're still going to have high intensity every now and then, but we're just not going to have it as often. Because what we've found is that things like VO2 max, if you talk about like oxygen consumption, not maybe the speed at VO2 max, but like the metabolic side of it, the science side, I talked last week in that L3 lecture was like there's a long shelf life to it, right? Like if we build up VO2 max, it lasts for a while. And so the reason why we start with those long base kind of trainings is they have a long shelf life. Like if we develop those characteristics, they last for a while with just maintenance check-ins, right? Whereas things like absolute max speed have a much shorter shelf life. Like we got to kind of check into those. It's like a neurologic component, like how the neurons actually talk to the muscles. And if we don't keep telling, and refining how they're doing that, they sort of forget, they lose their edge. And so you have to check in with max speed a little bit more. And so that's why when we get to racing season, we're looking at like, we might have like 1 or 2 or 3 endurance sessions a week, but we're checking in on different lengths of max speed more often, right? Because we got to keep like keeping that fresh and in our mind, especially with a race coming up.
Yeah. Is there a is that check in at max speed? Like when you think about the fall, right? Or the winter in December and January, right? And again, like every athlete, like again, there's probably half the athletes out there are like, hey, I want to improve my scores now and this and that, right? Like whatever. But when you think about the long-term context of like, for the most part, right, we're trying to peak in, we're trying to have our best performances in the spring and, throughout the season, right? And no one likes losing races in March and April.
Right.
Like we may say that, hey, it's about May, but we want to kind of be okay in March, April, and beyond, right? But with those check-ins of peak intensity, is that something that there's an accumulation, like if there's a lower shelf life, hopefully this makes sense, but if there's a lower shelf life or a more limited shelf life of high intensity work, race intensity type work, right? That kind of 2K plus type work. Is there a requirement that you should be checking in on that frequently in a pure base phase? Like, is there any value to be gained in those frequent check-ins in October and November and December to that peak performance? Or is it more, hey, you got to kind of really turn the knee or flip the switch and focus on that in February, March, April kind of thing? Does that make sense?
Yeah. There's definitely some benefit in checking into it because like those check-ins, there's plenty of information out there that says like, oh, well, you could do like to increase your VO2 max, you can do like a crazy amount of minutes at like a moderate intensity, or you can do like a HIIT session. or something like that, where it's high intensity, shorter duration, things like that. And that hit session even has some benefits for VO2 max on par with those long and low minutes, right? Now, I would say like it's how you structure your volumes, right? Like in your ratios, because like in December, in November, right? Like we're maybe doing 10, 20% high intensity of the total volume we're doing, right? And so we're checking in with it, but it's not obviously the lion's share, right? And we don't want to do like when you're doing a big base session, right? And the longer sessions, like those carry a certain amount of fatigue with them, and more so maybe than some of the higher intensity. Like the higher intensity has a fatigue really high right after the thing, but like, a day later, you might feel okay to do something again, right? If you're doing a lot of volume, right? Like that fatigue accumulates over time and builds on it. And so you can't do high intensity every day. Like you have to spread it out. And especially if you're doing high base, like a lot of high intensity is going to be really, really tough. And I would say like the ebb and flow of the year, right? Like if we build up to a peak performance and then we give some active recovery, like we want the athlete to start building again their base again, just because we don't want it to fall back down to where we were at the start of the last year, right? And we can all remember back to that like first 2K in December. Like the neurons aren't really firing as best as they probably could when it's race season. We've only maybe touched that intensity a little bit here and there. So that first 2K of the season really like is tough, right? But that's where like the check-in comes, is like it's the start of the race season, or the start of like more intensity being built into the program. That like, well, we would love to see that be within some percentage or even the same as like our previous 2K, right? Like, okay, that means we're starting at a better place than we were a year ago, 2 years ago, right? Like, and so we're tracking that December 2K over like a 4-year period, and just saying that we haven't taken a step back. We've taken we've taken 2 steps forward last spring, and we took maybe a step back. And so now we're at a higher level than we were last fall, and we're still moving forward, right? And so like, I think there's some benefit to including some intensity in your base training, like just to keep that. I always, when I talk to my athletes, I'm saying you're just keeping the knife sharp, right? Like you're just sharpening it, making sure that like if you have to use it, it's there. Like we're not honing it down to like, a samurai sword.
Yeah.
Like we are just like keeping it sharp. We're just letting it not be dull, and it's like to use another like, metaphor, is like it's like salt in a recipe. Like you use it a little bit, but like too much is too much, So.
And I think like another, like if this makes sense, but it's like you're touching the intensity throughout your training program. However, the frequency of those sessions is drastically different in October, November, December, even January than what it would look like in April and May, obviously, right? March, April, and May. Like it's like, it's still, when you come back to like those different different areas of training that we're trying to hone in on, right? Those different zones of training, in many ways, they all exist all the time to a degree. But if you look at it as a pie chart, right? It's the shifting of the pieces. Does that sound about right?
Yeah, 100%, right? Like if we were to say it was a 3-zone model, right? Like there's low, medium, and high, right? In a base training period, like that high zone is going to be maybe 15-20% of the training volume. That low zone is probably going to be 60%, and that middle zone is going to be the what's left over, right? Like the other 20%, 30%, whatever it is. And then when you go to race season, like just to starkly contrast from base season to race season, then what we're going to be talking about is like that high intensity might be 40% of our training volume, and the low intensity is now only 30%, 40%, and then there's another 30 or 40%, 20% right there in the center, like to get my math right. So 40, 40, 20, in that center zone, right? Like we start to, I say sometimes when I try and teach coaches periodization and training plan design, is it's like you're a DJ at a booth, and it's like you have the little shifting knobs, and you're you're constantly tweaking the sound of the performance to try and get the whole like orchestra playing, the conductor playing the entire orchestra. We move, different parts up at different times in the music, to make the emphasis.
Yeah. And for like, that makes a lot of sense where it's like, again, like there's nothing wrong with touching different intensities throughout the season. Like, and in many ways it's encouraged to touch these different intensities. It's just, again, like if all you're doing in the fall is intensity, then you're going to be neglecting that bottom of the pyramid. If you don't touch intensity at all in May, then your brain's not going to recognize, oh, this is what we're supposed to be racing here. And that's when, again, everyone knows that feeling of, oh, we're just not like, oh, this is a shock to the system. Is that?
Yeah. And if you're trying to, like, I don't want to say like burn out, but like, the candle that burns brightest burns shortest, like, yeah, if we do a bunch of intensity in the fall, like I guarantee that December 2K, like, is going to be great. Like, it's going to be a great 2K. Like, you PR, all of that stuff. But like, now you have to put base back in. You have to do something to like slow that burn for the year, because like you've kind of burned a match to like have that peak, so now we have to like find more matches, and so you really have to like balance that early success, because if you build it up quickly, like, yeah, you'll see that early success, but like playing the long game is where like you'll see even more success and it'll last longer.
Yeah, that's a super interesting way. I love that you said it like that, but like where it's like a lot of high school athletes, right? Bringing it back into putting ourselves in the shoes of these high school athletes and athletes out there. It's like, if I don't PR, then this was a failure, right? If I don't PR, then this was an unsuccessful piece. And I think that's just a part of the, the external influences that go within the rowing networks and stuff like that, which again, like, but also, people are innately competitive, right? And they want to see progress, right? Like, oh, if I'm not supposed to peak at that point, I still wanted to, they kind of think about it like that. Right. It's like, if I wasn't supposed to improve at that point, like I still wanted to, right? And it hurts that I didn't, right? I think that's like an important piece.
Right. And like everybody wants to go to like the best school or something like that. And so like, yeah, it's performance based, like it's a meritocracy, right? Like at some point we can't get around that. And like if you're trying to get recruited and all of those things, like, trust me, I understand the like ploy of like, I would rather, like put up a good number, but then it's like, how many times have we heard like the freshman who was like the standout freshman gets recruited to a team and he never PRs for the next 4 years, right? Like it's unfortunate. It does our sport a disservice in some ways, because we're looking at longevity and like staying in the sport and things like that, like not breeding frustration by being, like that it's so binary in that performance of like 2K,
Yeah.
And I think you and I have talked about it before about like, there's so many tests that a college coach could ask for to like get a holistic picture of the athlete, that probably like if I were a college coach these days, like I'd want to know those things more than a 2K, because like I want to know the athlete's potential over time, not, oh, it's great, like you're a 6-minute, 2K here your senior year of high school. Like I love that. But like, what do some of those other metrics look like? Because I want you to be a 5:45 by the time you're a junior in college, right? Like that's what I want. I want you to be my monster and my V8, like.
Yeah, that's a huge point. Like, again, like I think that's, and also like, just, I want to be conscious of your time here, but like that's a big point where again, it's like when your team is training for base in the fall and having this base and you're going off and trying to do like a lot of, like your body's not prepped, like the connection between the brain and the intensity is not quite there when in October when you're getting ready for the head of the Charles. But there's this underlying factor of, oh, I need to produce 2 kicks because that coach is going to be there. I want to tell him that PR. Like those are always just different variables. But I think understanding the why behind that is really valuable. And
yeah,
in closing, I have one kind of last little bit to kind of talk about in terms of just structuring a training program. And I want to be conscious of your time as you move down this, or as you have your things to do. But in regards to a training program, and if you had to kind of take I don't want to take, a week in April and say, hey, Nick, design for me a week in April, because now every coach is going to be like, oh, well, I did exactly what Nick said, and
Yeah, yeah, and
I didn't have a great Saturday, and this didn't go well, right? But
yeah, right,
if we go to like September, right?
right,
And there's a training program, and you're trying to kind of create an ideal 6 to 10 session kind of program. Like,
hmm
I'm curious to hear from you, like, what would that look like? And you could even draw from you personally, right? Where it's like, okay,
yeah,
the message here is I'm building my base. I'm taking all these puzzle pieces. I'm also maybe considering some strength training, which again, if we do a part, or I would love to do a
yeah.
part two at some point and talk about some of
Oh
that
yeah,
stuff too. Because we could totally dive into some of that stuff. But what would what would that week kind
yeah,
of look like for you,
yeah.
and how you would structure fitting
Mhm.
all those blocks in, or all those puzzle pieces in?
Right, right, right. So I always draw it back to, I think, as a coach, if you design like your annual plan so that in September, what are the characteristics you're really trying to get out of the athlete? So, in September, we're looking for, base endurance. We're looking for maybe some lactate threshold power, right? Like we're maybe not looking at peak power, but we're looking at threshold power, right? Like we want to build that. Um, we might be focusing on some athletes, some skill development, which can go into that aerobic base. Like, okay, we're just going to take more strokes. We're going to get more efficient. We're going to work at that thing. In the weight room, if we do a part two and we talk solely resistance training, right? Like we're trying to build like maybe some changes in body composition, build lean muscle, build muscle in general, hypertrophy. Um, the weight room can be a great place to build muscular endurance as well, right? In a little bit more isolated fashion. Um, and so, like, my September is going to try and keep those five ideas in mind, right? And so, when I sit down and I start progressively like developing my weeks, right? I'm gonna, have my like hierarchy list of like, okay, well, aerobic base is first, right? Like, and then it's like maybe I'm putting that with my basic strength and muscle building in the weight room, and I'm doing my threshold work is maybe third, and then my high intensity is maybe number 4 or 5, right? Um, Kind of putting skill development in with that base area. So then I'm going to design my week around like what I'd call like a heavy and light day, right? Like that lactate threshold work is going to be a higher fatigue inducing. So I'm going to make that a heavy day. Um, Me personally, I like pairing that with the weight room when we're doing kind of in strength endurance. So like that day might look like, okay, we're going to do longer interval pieces in the morning. And then if we have a second session in the afternoon, like with some time period so that the body can recover a little bit, we might have a weight session where we're building strength endurance and things like that. Um, but then I'm going to pair that with maybe like the following day or a day after that, the 2 days after that, they're going to be a little bit lighter. They're going to be more aerobic based. It's going to be more skill development. Um, we're gonna have that contrast of like, oh, this was like a heavy work day, so we build up a lot of fatigue on that day. So then we're going to train the other day, but it's going to be at a lighter intensity, so you can still get something out of the session, right? And so my week might look like 2 or 3 heavy days, where 2 of those days are like maybe a longer interval kind of structure with maybe a weight session, and then my Saturday might be like the day where we're testing like the longest piece. Like, we send them out there and we do 2 by 5K, or something like that, where it's, the cap for the week. And then we give them like a full day off, and um, I like to sort of micromanage my training weeks a little bit. I like really nerd out a little bit on like, well, how many hours can I give them between sessions, right? Like if I give them an afternoon off and then like we don't practice again till, the afternoon the following day, like that's a full 24 hours that I can give them. And so like you can kind of move those puzzle pieces around with that in mind. But again, I'm just always evaluating, okay, well, how hard was the work on the day we did here? What does that look like fatigue wise? And like, what am I expecting them to do afterwards, right? If we're trying, like, I might progress that over 3 weeks, where like that third week, like maybe I'm going to challenge them a little bit and I'm going to give them 2 long interval days back to back, but then we're going to get a full day off or something like that. Like, how am I going to progressively overload? And again, it looks different from my novice athlete to my advanced athlete, what they can accommodate training load wise, to get the most out of it, right? Because again, I have to keep in mind that like the body responds to overload. And so like if I give the novice workout to my varsity athlete, like they might not benefit the same way. And so I might have to change that a little bit here and there. So
yeah, no, that's actually really helpful.
I didn't really give like oh, we do 3x4K on this day or anything like that and get into like programming of it. But like I think it's like giving yourself that option of like, well, here are my goals, here are the like principles that I try and follow. Like within that, like in some ways, the actual programming doesn't matter as long as we're meeting those goals.
Yeah, that's a good way to kind of summarize things. I think my last question for you as we kind of close things out, my last question for you would be, what, as it pertains to the science of training, right, and the science of the why, right, why we do the things we do, right? What's one last takeaway or one last piece of advice that you would give for the high school athletes who are carving their own path a little bit for the purposes of peak performance at some point down the line, or even the coaches? I think is even a better people to, or a better audience to address. It's like for who are designing their training program and they're trying to incorporate a little bit more of the why, right? Why is a synonym for science in my mind today.
Yeah.
But the why behind, why they do the things they do. What's one last kind of little takeaway or piece of advice that you would advise for those coaches and athletes?
Yeah. I would say just like have a critical mind about what you're reading and what you're consuming, right? Like every Instagram influencer is a expert, and sometimes they miscite some of the things, if you're going to go deep into the science and you want to find something on like Google Scholar or something like that, I say like have a critical mind, try and, get what you can, ask questions. Like your best resources are other coaches. For the coach in us all, like talking to other coaches is a good resource. But like if you do go in the deep science and you're trying to get like really scientific with it and read some of these things, sometimes the methods section is the one that's like always overlooked and never considered. Like, okay, well, I always start with like, okay, I'm training high school athletes or college athletes. Like at the end of the day, I'm going to call those like either new athlete or a recreationally trained athlete. Like they're not a professional, they're not an elite athlete. A lot of these studies get done on elite athletes because that's the populace they can work with and the ones that are most willing to go through some of these tests for them. But you don't train an elite athlete like you do a novice athlete, right? And so if you read this thing, it's like, oh man, this researcher said I need to do 3 sessions of 5x5 for 4 weeks, and that's going to help me with my VO2 max, right? Well, if they did that, they probably did that with an elite athlete, and he was able to do 3 sessions of 5x5 a week. Like the novice athlete, like you're gonna put them in bed rest with 3 sessions that week, And so taking it with like a grain of salt and that critical mind of how we approach science, and that like we're really comparing apples to apples at some point and not apples to oranges.
Yeah. Oh, that's awesome. That's a great way to close things out. And Nick, I know we jam-packed a lot of information into a condensed format, and in many ways that's exactly what I wanted to do. Get as much from your time as we could. Well, I would love to do a part 2 at some point down the line.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I think we could really dive into some things. But again, I really appreciate it. Good luck with everything that you got going on, and thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Absolutely.